It started on one of those quiet nights where every sound feels amplified. The kind of night where silence itself becomes oppressive, wrapping around you like a heavy blanket. I was alone in the house, a fact I'd usually find comforting, but that night, the stillness felt different. The only sounds were the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards under my feet and the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. The air was cold, not from the temperature outside, but from a kind of chill that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. At first, I thought I was just tired. Shadows seemed to flicker in the corners of my vision, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just the dim light from the old lamp on the side table, its weak bulb casting faint shapes across the walls. But as the minutes turned to hours, I realized it wasn't just my imagination. These weren't ordinary shadows. They weren't simply responding to the play of light. They were moving. I sat frozen in the living room, staring down the hallway. The darkness there was different, deeper, heavier, almost tangible. It was as if the shadows had mass, sliding along the walls with a deliberate slowness that defied logic. A cold draft brushed against the back of my neck, sending shivers down my spine. I turned sharply, expecting to see an open window or door. But everything was closed, locked tight as it had been all evening. The sensation didn't leave, though, lingering like an unseen presence just out of reach. That's when I heard it. A faint rustling sound, like fabric brushing against the walls. It came from the hallway, a soft, almost hesitant noise that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table, fumbling with the flashlight. The small beam of light trembled as I pointed it down the hallway. At first, it seemed to cut through the darkness, illuminating the faint outline of the walls and door frames. But the shadows, they didn't move. Instead, they twisted. They curled and expanded, shifting like smoke caught in reverse. The more I stared, the more unnatural they seemed, their movements deliberate and unrelenting. And then I saw it. A shape within the shadows, darker than the surrounding void. It wasn't solid, not in the way a person is, but it was unmistakably there. A presence, a thing. The figure began to slide forward, inch by inch, its movements agonizingly slow but deliberate. The air around me grew colder with every step it took. A biting chill that seemed to seep into my bones. I stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the coffee table. My phone flew from my hand, the flashlight spinning wildly before clattering to the floor. The beam of light went out, plunging me into complete darkness. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing. Then, from the suffocating void, a voice emerged, a whisper. It called my name. The sound was soft and deliberate, as though it were spoken directly into my ear. The voice was unfamiliar, yet there was an unsettling intimacy to it, like it knew me in a way that no one else did. I scrambled to my feet, my heart hammering in my chest, and bolted for the front door. I didn't bother grabbing my keys or shoes. I just ran, my bare feet slapping against the cold pavement as I fled into the night. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, I was several blocks away. The streetlights above me flickered weakly, and the shadows of trees swayed ominously in the wind. I turned to look back at the house. Its windows were dark, no light spilling from the rooms I had left behind. But even from this distance, I could see the shadows. They were there, gathered at the windows, watching. I didn't go back that night. I stayed with a friend, telling them I needed to crash after a rough evening. I didn't mention the shadows, the cold, or the voice that had whispered my name. What could I say? That my house had come alive with something unexplainable? That I had been chased out by shadows? The next day, I returned in broad daylight. The house looked normal in the sunlight, quiet, still, and unremarkable. I told myself it had been a bad dream or a trick of the mind caused by exhaustion. But as I stepped inside, a chill washed over me, the same biting cold that had gripped me the night before. The air felt heavy, suffused with a tension that seemed to hum just below the surface. I forced myself to walk through every room, opening closets and checking corners, as if I could somehow prove to myself that there was nothing there, nothing lurking, nothing watching, but the feeling never left. Weeks passed, and I tried to convince myself that everything was fine. I kept the lights on at all hours, never letting the house sink into complete darkness. But it didn't help. Every night I felt it. The weight of the shadows, the faint rustling sounds, the cold that seeped into the room even with the heat turned up. I never saw the shape again, but I always felt its presence. One night as I lay in bed, I heard it again. The whisper. It didn't call my name this time. Instead, it said something else. Something I couldn't quite understand, but which filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. That was the last night I spent in the house. Even now, I wonder if the shadows ever truly left. I've moved to a new place, far from that quiet street. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I feel the same chill. And sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I think I see them, waiting. The day was gray and overcast, the kind of weather that presses down on you, heavy and suffocating. My friends and I had decided to spend the morning hiking, hoping the fresh air would lighten the mood. As we reached the ridge, the group naturally began to spread out, each person drawn to the scenery in their own way. I found myself wandering along a narrow path. The trees lining it were old and twisted, their gnarled branches reaching out and intertwining above like skeletal hands. The further I went, the quieter it became, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under my boots. That's when I saw him. He was sitting on the slope just off the trail, motionless. He wore a dark tracksuit, and his head was completely shaved. Something about him felt off, unnatural. He sat so still, so rigid, it was as if he had been frozen in place. I hesitated, but then called out, "Hey, are you all right?" My voice sounded unnaturally loud in the stillness. No response. The silence around me grew heavier, almost palpable. My heart started to race, but I couldn't walk away. My curiosity outweighed the growing sense of dread. Slowly, cautiously, I stepped closer. That's when he moved. Not his body, just his head. It turned toward me, pivoting in a way that no human head should move, impossibly smooth, like a doll's head on a hinge. But what stopped me cold wasn't the motion. It was his face, or rather the lack of one. Where there should have been eyes, a nose, a mouth, there was nothing. Just another back of the head. Bald, pale, and seamless. I staggered back, my breath catching in my throat. My foot caught on a root, and I nearly fell. My heart thundered in my chest, drowning out every other sound. Then he stood up. The motion wasn't natural. It was fluid, too smooth, like a shadow rising to its full height. He didn't turn his body toward me. Instead, he began to move, backward. Not walking, though, gliding. The way a figure in a dream moves, effortlessly, soundlessly. His head, or whatever it was, remained fixed on me, watching without eyes. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. Instinct took over, and I turned to run. The branches tore at my arms and face as I sprinted down the trail, the world blurring around me. My boots slipped on the gravel, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I felt his gaze, or the absence of it, pressing against my back. When I finally burst into the clearing where my friends were, I spun around, expecting to see him gliding after me, but the path was empty. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. How could I? Who would believe me? They'd laugh, or worse, think I'd lost my mind. So, I stayed silent. But the memory hasn't left me. Sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet, I feel it. A faint, almost imperceptible prickle on the back of my neck. like someone is watching from behind. It was an old, beat-up sedan. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about it. My Uncle Valera had bought it for a bargain from a man in the next town. A deal too good to pass up, he'd said with a grin. The car looked fine, aside from a few dents and scratches, but there was something about it, something intangible that felt off. From the moment Valera brought it home, strange things began to happen. The headlights flickered randomly, even when the car was off, glowing faintly like dim, blinking eyes. The engine roared to life in the middle of the night, startling the entire household and sending my aunt into fits of rage. But the smell, oh, the smell, was the worst. It was faint at first, a metallic tang, sharp and unpleasant, like rusted iron or old blood. Valera scrubbed the interior endlessly, pouring bottle after bottle of cleaner onto the seats and carpets. It didn't matter. The stench always came back, clinging to the air like a ghost refusing to leave. "It's just an old car," Valera said whenever we voiced our unease. "She's temperamental, that's all." He laughed, but it was forced, and his eyes darted nervously toward the car. One evening, as we sat around the kitchen table, Valera mentioned the man who had sold him the sedan. "He was strange," Valera said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Kept saying the car wanted a new home. Wouldn't even look me in the eye." His words hung in the air like a bad omen, but we didn't press him further. Things took a darker turn about a month later. Valera lent the car to his friend Boris, who needed to run an errand in a neighboring village. Boris never came back. The next morning, the police found the car overturned in a ditch. Boris was dead. But it wasn't the crash that killed him. The officers said his body was mangled in ways that didn't match the accident. Cuts, deep and deliberate, marked his torso. His face was twisted in a grimace of pure terror. The explanation was as impossible as it was horrifying. Something had attacked Boris before the car even went off the road. We begged Valera to get rid of the car, but he refused. "It's just bad luck," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. His hands trembled as he spoke, and for the first time, he didn't meet our eyes. A week later, Valera came home pale as a ghost. He dropped into a chair, his breath shallow and ragged. "I saw something," he stammered, "while I was driving back from the market." We leaned in, bracing ourselves. "There was a figure," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "sitting in the back seat." He described how he'd caught sight of it in the rearview mirror, a shadowy figure, still and silent, staring directly at him. Valera panicked, swerving off the road and narrowly avoiding a crash. When he turned around, the back seat was empty. After that night, Valera refused to drive the car. He parked it in the yard and left it there, untouched. The grass grew up around its tires, and dust settled thick on the windows, but the car never seemed abandoned. The headlights still flickered at night, glowing faintly, like eyes watching from the shadows. Months passed, and the car became a sort of silent tormentor. No one dared go near it, but its presence was always felt. Late at night, I'd hear faint noises, the creak of a door hinge, the hum of the engine turning over, though the car hadn't been started in weeks. Eventually, Valera decided to sell it. He found another buyer, a stranger who seemed eager to take the sedan off his hands, despite Valera's unusually low asking price. We watched from the porch as the man drove away, the sedan's tail lights vanishing down the dusty road. As the car disappeared into the distance, Valera muttered under his breath, "Good riddance." We never saw the car again, but its memory lingered. Even now, years later, I sometimes hear the faint sound of an engine roaring in the distance on quiet nights. It's always the same, a low, guttural growl, growing louder before fading away. And I can't help but wonder, who's driving it now?